What historical fact makes you cry? After the Pearl Harbor attack, at least some men were alive in a pocket of air inside one of the capsized ships. Navy personnel could hear them banging on the hull and trying to signal for help, but there was no way to get at them safely. The water was full of fuel and oil, so blowtorches weren't a workable idea. And there was no way for divers to get into the ship because the damage had rendered the whole thing a death trap of twisted steel. There wasn't even any way to communicate with the trapped men. So the guards at Pearl Harbor had to listen to those calls for help getting weaker and weaker, while inside everyone slowly suffocated. When they hauled the ship up for scrap later, there were 16 notches scratched onto the wall of that compartment, which means at least one casualty of Pearl Harbor lived until December 23, 1941. The rape of Nanking in 1937. Looking up photos of what the Japanese did there left me silent for a while. They raped and murdered women, bayonet babies, you can look up a photo of it, used the wounded as rifle and bayonet practice, forced mothers on their sons and fathers on their daughters, and made a contest out of beheading civilians. There is a Japanese newspaper article you can look up about it. It's disgusting, and the worst part about it is that the Japanese government denies most of these acts, along with a lot of other war crimes that they committed afterwards. It always shakes me to my core to know that human beings are capable of doing such horrible things to one another. And smile while doing it. Sacagawea, who accompanied Lewis and Clark on their expedition to explore the lands we now know as the Western United States, had a vital coincidence on the journey that always makes me emotional to think about. She was born a Shoshone but was taken around the age of 12 and made a slave to the Hidatsa. After being with them for 3 or so years, she was sold to a French man named Toussaint Charbonneau who took her as a wife. When Lewis and Clark met her, she was about 16 years old and pregnant with Charbonneau's child. The birth was a tough one and Lewis helped with the child's safe delivery before Sacagawea and Charbonneau joined them on the expedition. Lewis and Clark knew they would meet the Shoshone on their journey and were hoping Sacagawea could help them procure some supplies, especially horses, to help them cross the Rocky Mountains. Sacagawea didn't speak English. She spoke Shoshone and Hidatsa. Charbonneau spoke Hidatsa and French, and one of the members of Lewis and Clark's expedition spoke French and English. Suffice to say, translation was complicated and complex. When the expedition finally came upon the Shoshone's territory, they agreed to meet and hear Lewis and Clark's proposal. They sat down around the fire and began negotiations. The chief of the tribe began to speak with Sacagawea, and the conversation proceeded rapidly. The others, unable to really understand what was going on, were confused when she and the chief began to cry, and then to embrace. In the years since her capture, it turned out, Sacagawea's brother had become chief. He had believed her dead and she did not recognize him at first. The celebration, when the tribe learned who she was, and the appreciation bestowed upon Lewis and Clark for returning her, is hard to completely express. Lewis recorded their reunion in his journal. Shortly after Captain Clark arrived with the interpreter Charbonneau, and the Indian woman, who proved to be a sister of the chief Kamiwait. The meeting of those people was really affecting, particularly between Sa Cah and an Indian woman, who had been taken prisoner at the same time with her, and who had afterwards escaped from the Minataires and rejoined her nation. Whenever I start to think about what she went through, from her capture and slavery among the Hidatsas, to her being taken as a wife by Charbonneau, traveling across largely unknown lands with people whose language she didn't speak, to finally being reunited with her family, it always makes me emotional. She went through so much. I learned about this in a Dan Carlin podcast. During the German-Soviet War, there was a Red Army soldier who sang each night with a hauntingly beautiful voice. His comrades would give him their tea rations and scarves to protect his larynx. One night, he couldn't sing because he had gotten sick. A German soldier crawled across no man's land and tossed something into the Soviet trench. The Soviet soldiers thought it was a grenade. However, it was a package containing a letter asking if the singer was okay and if he needed medicine. A truly heartwarming moment in an otherwise horrific front. A letter from the Civil War by Sullivan Ballou. My very dear Sarah, the indications are very strong that we shall move in a few days, perhaps tomorrow. Lest I should not be able to write again, I feel impelled to write a few lines that may fall under your eye when I shall be no more. I have no misgivings about, or lack of confidence in the cause in which I am engaged, and my courage does not halt or falter. I know how strongly American civilization now leans on the triumph of the government and how great a debt we owe to those who went before us through the blood and sufferings of the Revolution. And I am willing, perfectly willing, to lay down all my joys in this life, to help maintain this government, and to pay that debt. Sarah, my love for you is deathless, it seems to bind me with mighty cables that nothing but omnipotence could break. And yet my love of country comes over me like a strong wind and bears me unresistibly on with all these chains to the battlefield. The memories of the blissful moments I have spent with you come creeping over me, and I feel most gratified to God and to you that I have enjoyed them for so long. And hard it is for me to give them up and burn to ashes the hopes of future years, when, God willing, we might still have lived and loved together, and seen our sons grown up to honorable manhood, around us. I have, I know, but few and small claims upon divine providence, but something whispers to me, perhaps it is the wafted prayer of my little Edgar, that I shall return to my loved ones unharmed. If I do not, my dear Sarah, never forget how much I love you, and when my last breath escapes me on the battlefield, it will whisper your name. Forgive my many faults and the many pains I have caused you. How thoughtless and foolish I have oftentimes been. How gladly would I wash out with my tears every little spot upon your happiness. But, oh Sarah! If the dead can come back to this earth and flit unseen around those they loved, I shall always be near you, in the gladdest days and in the darkest nights, always, always, and if there be a soft breeze upon your cheek, it shall be my breath, as the cool air fans your throbbing temple, it shall be my spirit passing by. Sarah, do not mourn me dead, think I am gone and wait for thee, for we shall meet again. Sullivan Ballou was killed a week later at the First Battle of Bull Run, July 21, 1861. The story of Joe Arity. Joe was tested and found to have an IQ of 46, and the mind of a 6-year-old. Despite this, Joe Arity was executed at the age of 23 by the state of Colorado. In addition, Joe was innocent of the crime for which he was convicted and the victim of a coerced confession. Joe's mental challenges were so significant that he didn't even understand he was about to die as they walked him to the gas chamber. While held on death row during the appeals process, Arity often played with a toy train, given to him by prison warden Roy Best. The warden said that Arity was the happiest prisoner on death row. He was liked by both the prisoners and guards. Best became one of Arity's supporters and joined the effort to save his life. He said of Arity before his execution, he probably didn't even know he was about to die, all he did was happily sit and play with a toy train I had given him. For his last meal, Arity requested ice cream. When questioned about his impending execution, he showed blank bewilderment. He did not understand the meaning of the gas chamber, telling the warden, "No, no, Joe won't die." He was reported to have smiled while being taken to the gas chamber. Momentarily nervous, he calmed down when the warden grabbed his hand and reassured him. Whenever I think about him smiling and walking to his death, it makes me fucking ill. And deeply ashamed of the system of governance that allowed it to happen, even 80 years removed from it. In World War II, an American pilot named Charles Brown was flying a B-17 in a bomb raid over Germany, where his aircraft was severely shot up and entered a free fall when Brown passed out. When Brown awoke, he was only a few thousand feet above the ground and barely was able to recover the aircraft. When the Luftwaffe spotted a limping B-17 far below the formation, they dispatched a pilot named Franz Stigler, a soon-to-be ace just 1 kill away, with 2 down B-17s earlier that day. As he approached from the rear, Stigler noticed that the B-17's tail gunner didn't move, and after further inspection, realized he and several other gunners were dead. Stigler saw this and remembered what his flight instructor had said years ago: "If you shoot a man in a parachute, I'll shoot you myself." Stigler saw this limping B-17 as no different from a downed pilot in a parachute. To prevent German flak cannons from taking it out, Stigler flew in formation with the B-17 all the way until the English Channel, where it landed safely. Stigler never mentioned the incident, and could have been court-martialed for it. Decades later, Charles went looking for the enemy pilot that saved his life that fateful day, and eventually met him face to face, becoming close friends and dying just a few months apart from each other in 2008. Squanto's full life story rarely gets the attention it deserves. Long before the Plymouth settlement began, fishing boats had been crossing the Atlantic to the coast of Massachusetts because codfish was highly profitable on the European market. Squanto was an adolescent who met some of the sailors. Native American culture had no equivalent to press gangs, though he suspected nothing when he got drunk for the first time in his life. When he woke up after passing out, he was already aboard ship watching the coastline recede. From there he worked aboard ship traveling to the Caribbean, to Portugal, and to England. This went on for years until he managed to return home. Then when he finally set foot on his homeland again, he found out he was a sole survivor. An epidemic had swept through the coast and killed everyone in his village, his family, his friends, everyone who had been close to him growing up, all gone. Imagine going through that much to get home, then discovering there was no home to return to. Context for Redditors who didn't grow up learning about this: when English settlers first arrived on the coast of Massachusetts, they were astonished to be greeted by a native man who spoke fluent English. Squanto introduced them to North American crops and taught them cultivation techniques. From the perspective of the colonists, it was incredible good fortune. That's the side of things which gets taught in U.S. schools. From Squanto's perspective, less so. He befriended them. But that little stretch of coastline was where his village used to be. An experiment done on newborns. Copy-paste, perhaps the most disturbing of all the experiments gleefully related by Salenbean, were the tests Frederick reputedly had carried out on infants. The origins of human language was something that fascinated the emperor greatly, and he embarked upon an experiment that, he hoped, would prove what was the original language of mankind. In his eagerness to determine what language had been given to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, Frederick gave a group of babies over into the care of nurses who were given strict instructions on how to raise them. The nurses were ordered not to interact with the children other than when strictly necessary. The infants could be fed and bathed, but no more, and they were not to be spoken to or cooed over under any circumstances. Tragically for those involved, Frederick never got an answer to the question he posed, and the original language of mankind remained hidden from him. The children, starved of any form of affection, warmth and basic interaction, died, quite simply, of a lack of love. It is unclear how many infants were used in the experiment, or how many times it was carried out, let alone who the parents of these children were, but the fact remains that the experimentation was questionable in nature and not scientifically viable. Canadian residential schools. In Canada, the government had set up a school system for Indigenous children to, quote, take the Indian out of the Indian, and to adopt them into a modern, civilized society. It was ran by the Canadian government and the Catholic Church, of which the latter has never apologized for, and ran from the 1800s to as late as 1996. They were forced from their homes, children as young as 5, most to never see their families again. 1/3 RD of the graduating class of each grade were killed. There was an abundance of abuse, from physical, mental and sexual. Indigenous boys were physically abused, Indigenous girls were raped and in some cases, forced to give birth and then their child was killed. They took their names, their languages and culture, and they're still fighting the horrors they faced. No one talks about it because Canada has a reputation to uphold as global peacekeepers. When I was in Canadian history, the teacher told us that it was an extremely heavy topic and if we needed to step out to take a moment, or even the duration of the class, to breathe, we could. In early 1993 James Bulger was a 2-year-old boy from Kirkby, Merseyside, England, who was abducted, tortured and killed by 2 10-year-old boys, making them the youngest convicted murderers in modern British history. Bulger was led away from a shopping centre as his mother had taken her eyes off him momentarily. His mutilated body was found on a railway line 2.5 miles, 4 kilometers, away 2 days after his abduction. CCTV showed the boys casually observing children, apparently selecting a target. On seeing the young one they led him by the hand to first a canal where they dropped him on his head and then to a railway line. Many people saw them, but either they did not intervene or believed the lies when they challenged them. The railway line was close to a police station. One of the boys threw blue Humbrol modeling paint, which they had shoplifted earlier, into Bulger's left eye. They kicked him, stamped on him and threw bricks and stones at him. Batteries were placed in Bulger's mouth and, according to police, some batteries may have been inserted into his anus, although none were found there. Finally, the boys dropped a 10 kilograms, 22 pounds iron bar, described in court as a railway fishplate, on Bulger. He sustained 10 skull fractures as a result of the bar striking his head. Bulger suffered so many injuries, 42 in total, that none could be isolated as the fatal blow. He was then laid across the railway tracks and with his head weighted down with rubble, in the hope that a train would hit him and make his death appear to be an accident. After the older boys left the scene, his body was cut in half by a train. Bulger's severed body was discovered 2 days later. This case brought the conviction age down to 10 years. How and why 2 young boys could think and do something so horrible is beyond me. Not sure if it qualifies, but the Uberlingen mid-air collision in 2002. I'm a sucker for air crash investigation documentaries, and usually don't get too shaken even when the death count is high or the pilots get deprived of control and forced to pointlessly try to land their plane only to crash, or fucking both. Japan Airlines Flight 123 is exactly that, but Uberlingen stings for multiple reasons. Most of the 71 victims were Russian children, going to Spain on a school trip, aboard Bashkirian Airlines Flight 2937, as the other plane was a DHL Cargo 757. The kids weren't even supposed to be in that aircraft, it was chartered after they missed the original flight they were supposed to board. There was only one air traffic controller on duty for that area that day. A primary radar device that would have alerted him of the planes being on a collision course way beforehand was out of commission for repairs. There was another plane dangerously low on fuel that demanded the ATC's attention to not crash themselves. Had the ATC done absolutely nothing, the accident would have been avoided. Both planes had something called TCAS, Traffic Collision Alert System, that loudly yelled at the DHL plane to go down and the Russian plane to go up, but the controller told the Russians to go down, and as they complied, their fate was sealed. A year later, a man named Vitaly Kalyev, who had lost his wife and 2 kids, and sanity, in the accident, tracked down the ATC and stabbed him to death, going to prison for it. According to Kalyev, he was offered a pitiful sum of money to not press charges against the company, and found that absolutely insulting, as he felt no one would face justice for the death of his family. Once he was released and went back to Russia, he was elected to a position in his local North Ossetia and celebrated as a hero. He recently got married again and his wife gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl, much like the deceased Kalayevs. Just all around awfulness, so much had to go wrong and it all culminated in so much pointless tragedy.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.